Instead of a formal academic lecture, what I wanted to do tonight is to reflect with you on some of the factors and some of the themes that have been present not only in my academic work, but also in my work as the newly founded director of this Christian-Muslim Studies network that Luce has founded, and some of the experiences and encounters that I've had. And to reflect to you a little bit about how some of the impact of global politics, of the way that particular contexts and encounters in what seems like far-off places, the Greek and Macedonian border, Sicily, Jakarta, Jerusalem, come to impact and shape the ways that we here in the United States, or we in the United Kingdom, interact with our neighbors. Our neighbors that may be of the same religious tradition or a different one or of none. And particularly the way that these have come to impact the ways that Christian-Muslim relations are perceived. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that the last 2 years have seen an increasing fracture in our societies. Increasing inability to understand one another, to engage in debate with any sort of nuance, to stand actually for justice and not for sound bites. And the question I want to ask is, what does it mean to think about Christian-Muslim relations and Christian-Muslim conversations in this fractured age? But to do that is to think both about theology and about politics. Christian-Muslim conversation is inherently an act of political theology. Whether it is intended to be or not, it involves certain political claims, political assumptions about what is just, about what is good, about what is human dignity. But at the same time, our political arena, since 2001, but even more so I think since 2014 and the summer of 2015, have come to be marked by fundamental claims about Islam, about Muslims, about their relationship to politics, to society, to Europe, to the West. And throughout this, there are certain assumptions that many Christians bring to the table. And I want to just reflect with you about some of those and about some of the ways we might think about that and respond to that. So that's what we're going to try to do today. It's going to be really easy. It'll be over in 40 minutes. We'll have solved all of the world problems. To do this, I want to engage very briefly, and these are all going to be extremely brief, with 3 ongoing case studies. And I chose them partly because they're areas that I've either worked or lived in or have recently visited. But there are also areas that give us different reflections on the ways that theology and politics intersect in Christian-Muslim relations. The first is the European response to the migration crisis. We might add the American or the Canadian, but now I have the fun pleasure of living sort of in Europe. So you can draw any connections you want between what I say about the European response and the American political arena. I'm sure you can, but let's try to create a little distance. Part of this is going to come from my own experience over the last 2 years, where I somehow stumbled in to representing the Church of Scotland on the World Communion of Reformed Churches Task Force on Migration in Europe. And what that's entailed is a series of visits, first to Budapest, second to the Greek-Macedonian border, and forthcomingly to Sicily, to think about how the church might engage politically, socially, economically with the ongoing crisis of migration in Europe. And it still is ongoing, even if the news has disappeared. The second is one that you may not be as familiar with, but is an important one in Christian-Muslim relations. That's a recent trial and conviction of the Jakartan governor for blasphemy, and I'll tell that story very briefly later. And finally, I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't ever talk about Jerusalem and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in 3 minutes, but hey, is the ongoing conflict and disagreement about Al-Aqsa and the worship in Jerusalem. All of them have their own particular context of how Christian, Muslim, secular, political, Jewish, Hindu relations intersect. But all of them will help us get a little different angle on how theology and politics intersect in Christian-Muslim relations. As you can probably guess, what I want to do in all three of these is trouble any simplistic account of how theology and religion and politics exist. So first, and I assume this one you know the best. When I arrived in Edinburgh, Scotland, it was August of 2015. My wife and children had not yet arrived because of visa issues and housing issues, and so I went down to the local pub for the first evening to get a meal, to get over jet lag, and I sat down watching football, soccer, on the television, having my meal, when the neighbor, a little intoxicated, interrupted me and asked what I was doing there. Are you a tourist in Edinburgh? No, I've just moved here. Oh, what are you doing? Well, I'm going to be a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. Oh, that's fantastic. What do you lecture in? This is when it gets awkward on airplanes or public, It's when you say accounting. Well, I teach Christian-Muslim relations. Oh, okay. That's interesting. Well, what do you think about the migration crisis and all these Muslims who are coming in to our country, all these immigrants who are taking our jobs? And I was very tired. I probably shouldn't have said this, but I said, well, don't you know I'm an immigrant who took a British person's job? It's true. I had to get a visa. I had to move across the Atlantic Ocean. The other two candidates for the job were both, they were English, so the Scots may have been happier that they gave it to an American. What this was, though, was indicative of certain assumptions about the immigration issue. That it's not simply an issue about immigration as such, or migrants as such, but that the immigration issue is refracted through other broader questions about belonging, about language, about race, about religion, and about identity. I, as an American, they knew I was educated because I was a lecturer. As American, educated, English-speaking, either Christian or secularist, we can assume, wasn't counted as an immigrant. But others, who may have been born and raised in Scotland for over 3 generations, because their last names were Ahmed or Siddiqui, were viewed as somehow migrants still. I think it's vital, if we're going to talk about the European responses to the migration crisis, is to be honest about the ways that both Christianity and Islam have figured prominently in the European response. That one of the central recurring questions isn't simply that there are migrants coming, but that these migrants happen to be brown or black and are perceived to be Muslim. This is most evident, of course, in some of the responses of various political leaders in places like Hungary, Slovakia, or Poland, in which the argument was made that they would accept refugees insofar as they were Christian. Now, this sort of explicit reference to Christianity as an intentionally European reality was a prominent feature in actually European political discourse over the last two years. Even politicians that were otherwise not Christian appealed to both Christianity and secularism as reasons to be wary about new migrants. François Fillon, who people thought was going to be the French Prime Minister, it didn't work out that way, argued in France, of all places, that there needed to be a return of Catholic values. This kind of appeal to Catholicism in the French political situation could not be imaginable if there wasn't also this threat of Muslims. what I think we're seeing in some ways are not only legitimate fears about migrants and movement as it relates to the terror attacks in Paris, in Belgium, and Manchester, many of which were actually committed by second-generation residents who had been on police watch, but a crisis of identity that is increasingly returning ideas of Islam as a political other, and is involving quite an appeal to Christianity as a site of Western identity, what you might call a comeback of Christendom and secularism. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the migration crisis later, but this is a picture that I took on the border of the Greek-Macedonian border. Now, Greece, of course, is in the center of Europe, right? It is where we got democracy and philosophy. It is clearly in Europe. And yet, actually, during the winter of 2015 and 16, it in some ways stopped being in Europe. A wall was built on the Macedonian border to stop the migration flow. And so Europe, which these same people that I'm talking about in terms of the comeback of Christendom often appeal to the history of philosophy, the history of Europe, appeal to Greece as the sort of cradle of it and Rome and Germany, was now actually no longer, in some ways, in Europe. Do you understand what I mean by this? The borders of Europe had shifted. And this always happens with the borders of Europe. Who's in and who's out shifts. Does anyone, no, I won't make a mod read this. In Arabic it says, tomorrow we will cross into Europe. Or in the Ahmad, ghadan can mean like in a future tomorrow. So even the Iraqi and the Syrian refugees that we saw caught on this border, about to enter into another cold winter, recognized that even though they had made it to Europe where there was this promise of human rights and asylum seeking, realized that now the goalposts had shifted. And Christianity, while not exclusively being a negative part of this story, was and continues to be a source of fear towards migrants for both legitimate and imagined reasons. I'll talk about this a little bit more. So here we see some of the ways in which these borders between Christendom and the Arab world, between the civilized and the heathen, are being actually, these long-standing tropes are being reenacted today in Christian-Muslim relations. Let me shift you to the other side of the world, to Jakarta, the fourth largest or fourth most populous country in the world, the most populous Muslim country in the world, one of the largest growing economies in the world. I had the privilege of visiting there as part of my work in February, and I am now an evangelist for Indonesia. Everyone should go visit. While I was there, it was in the midst of a very contentious situation. The then governor of Greater Jakarta, the city and the surrounding counties of over 30 million people, was a Christian. The governor of a predominantly Muslim city of approximately 85% of the population as Muslim. He was also ethnically Chinese, although he was born and raised in Indonesia. Ahok was his nickname. In the run-up to the election in October, he gave a campaign speech in which he quoted the Quran and tried to argue that having a non-Muslim as your leader wasn't against the Quranic teaching. A leader of a radical political Islamist group took this video clip, cut and pasted it, put it on YouTube in a very creative way. Not totally doctoring what he said, but doctoring the context, which led to massive protests in Jakarta against him, that he had blasphemed the Prophet and the Quran. What was fascinating about this case is that he went from leading to falling out of favor, and then in an initial election, he won, but not enough to win, and in the runoff, he eventually lost. When I was there was a number of questions about the future of Indonesian pluralism Indonesia prides itself on having a particular form of government, Pancasila, which is not secularism, but a plural, democratic state that recognizes the diversity of religion. But what many Indonesians noted is the ways in which transnational Islam were increasingly influencing their local politics. That these long-standing Indonesian traditions of interpreting the Quran in light of a particular school of law and in relationship to the broader diversity of Indonesia were now being challenged by money coming from certain countries in the Gulf and certain internet movements in which many people were learning their Islam not from their local madrasa or their local mosque, but from certain groups online. And so what was a political speech became a theological speech, and then this theological speech became a political speech. After he lost the election, he was eventually convicted of blasphemy and is currently in prison. Here you see a revival of certain forms of political engagement marked by rivalry and fear. You see the ways in which theological quotations and claims become issues of politics. Something similar actually happens in Europe. We just don't recognize it. I'll talk about that in a minute. And you also see the ways, in a place that may seem very distant to us, the ways that transnational identity, the ways that globalization and migration have come to shape and impact a local situation. The final thing I want to talk about is the ongoing conflict over worship at Al-Aqsa, or the Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount. As you may or may not know, over the last month, which is actually part of a longer series of conflicts over Jerusalem and worship, 3 Palestinians with Israeli citizenship had been on the Temple Mount, or the Haram al-Sharif, and opened fire on some guards who were Druze, it turned out, of Israeli citizenship, and killed them. And in response to this, the Israeli government, Netanyahu, closed the Haram al-Sharif, the third holiest site for Muslims. And closed it not just temporarily during the day, but closed it for Friday prayers. Wanting to set up certain entrance and exit points. It's part of a much broader story about the Israel-Palestine conflict we can talk about later. But what's happened over the intermediate last 10 days is acts of Christian-Muslim solidarity in support of the freedom of worship on Al-Aqsa. You may have seen this picture, if anyone can tell. Not this last Friday, but the Friday before, when it was closed. If anyone's been to Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, if you know Salahuddin Street, or Saladin Street, for those that don't like my pronunciation, which is the street, the major artery in the north part of East Jerusalem that you would enter into the Damascus Gate or enter into the holy site. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Muslim men decided to walk towards Al-Aqsa as they normally would, knowing that they would be stopped, bringing their prayer rugs with them, and laid down the prayer rugs on Salahuddin Street, so that the entire street, for a mile long, was turned into a site of Friday prayers. Can anyone notice the balding gentleman in the middle of this picture? Some of our travel seminar students actually met him last time they were in the Holy Lands. Can anyone notice anything interesting about him? He has a cross. And in fact, he's holding open a Bible. He's a Palestinian Catholic Christian who went to Friday prayers as an act of embodied solidarity, that the freedom of worship for one impacted the freedom of worship for others. You can find actually a video clip of it when the rest of the Muslims kneel to play sujood, to supplicate themselves. He crosses himself and bows his head as an act of presence and solidarity as both a Christian, right? He remains a Christian, but he is in solidarity with what he perceives to be a broader issue of Palestinian justice. This last Friday, something similar happened where the Lutherans, Anglicans, Greek Orthodox, Armenians, and Catholic Palestinian priests, bishops, patriarchs, and pastors went to Al-Aqsa and to the Temple Mount on Friday as well during prayers. None of these stories are actually quite the same. They have different configurations of how Christians and Muslims interact with one another. Different people in power, or different people under threat. But in all of the cases, we see that Christian-Muslim conversations are interacting in this nexus between theology and politics. There's one way that we tend to interpret this, which is to say that all of these events are just indicative of fundamental differences in religion and theology. That if we could just get to the core of what this tradition says about theology, we would understand the difference. I'm thinking here of that famous Atlantic article, "What Does ISIS Really Want?" That seemed to indicate if we could just get the text and the scripture and the exegesis right, we would understand the politics. There's one tendency in interpreting that tends to think in this way and tends to primarily focus on more fundamentalist traditions, that the problem is that they just have the wrong kind of theology and that they have theology at all. There's another tendency of interpreting this, which would tend to focus on contextualizing the situation, that all of it is actually just to its bare bones politics and economics and social justice. Right? And that the theological and religious and ideological claims that people make are really just cover for economic need or for political power. I think the one overestimates the power of theology. I say that as a theologian who wishes that theology was that powerful. And the one underestimates the imaginative power of religious ideas and theology. And what I want to talk about in the time I have left is the ways that we might think of these two actually not just intersecting, but existing somehow betwixt and between. As I always do, I'm talking too much. One thing we have to be aware of is that there's a wide variety of theologies of politics. One of the things that's most astonishing to me about living in the UK is the role that religion has in public life. We tend to speak about either the West or Western Europe or Christian views of politics as if they're monolithic, as if there's this one thing called secularism or church-state separation that's all the same. But in fact, there is as many varieties of secularisms as there are varieties of religious life. The ways, for instance, that France relates to between religion and politics is often commented on, is quite distinct from the American model. The British model, for me, is confounding of how much religion is in public. There are nativity scenes every which way in Scotland, even though Scotland's one of the least religious places in all of Europe in terms of church attendance. Handel's Messiah blares down the streets of the High Street. Church of Scotland ministers teach religion at, well, they're not called public, but what we would call public elementary schools, right? But we never would think of the UK as not a secular place in its politics, right? In Italy, certain amounts of tax money still go to either the Catholic Church or now the Waldensian Church. Right? So what we perceive as just the European way of secularism often involves a hidden presence of Christianity and Christian assumptions. The clearest way that you can see this is simply by the calendar of when you have holidays. If anyone's ever traveled to the Middle East and then suddenly been surprised while everyone's working on a Sunday, or things are closed on Friday night for Shabbat, you see this, right? I couldn't find one of Theresa May, the Queen, and the Archbishop, so our old Prime Minister, well, I didn't know, by the time I gave this, maybe Theresa May wouldn't be our Prime Minister anymore. But here what you see is actually some of the intersections of politics and religion in the UK, in which both the Queen and the Archbishop of Canterbury play this public role. I think coming to grips with the fact that we as Christians, or those of us that are Christians, I'm not saying everyone in the room is a Christian, but those of us even in the West who think of ourselves as ostensibly secular, actually have a wide varieties of configuring the relationship between religion, state, and public life. It's vital if we're going to begin to talk about Islam. Because being aware of the varieties in which the church, the state, and religion intersects in the West, or in other places that are Christian majority, means we can begin to challenge these simplistic notions that all of Islam is just about the merging of religion and politics. Simply. As if the Islamic tradition doesn't have its own rich diversity and variety of organizing and forming its relationship to Islam and public life. And you recognize that we are constantly contesting the role of religion in public life. In the United States, in the UK. You know this, yes? I don't need to give the examples. So the simple appeal to, okay, what the problem is that we've learned to separate religion from politics, whether we is Western, whether we is Jewish, whether we is Christian, and they haven't, and once they do, everything will be fine. One isn't an honest recognition of the diversity of ways that theology and politics interact in the West. Two, it's a failure to grasp the complexity and diversity of actually Islamic approaches to religion, politics, and law. There is not one thing. How, for instance, Sharia relates to the state is different in the Egyptian constitution and actually Egyptian practice. What it says in the Constitution and what happens in actual legal codes are different things. So just to say that this is the variety, this is a quote I always quote by Talal Asad. The attempt to understand Muslim traditions by insisting that in them religion and politics are coupled must, in my view, lead to failure. Partly because he argues that the very division begins to create what counts as religion and what counts as politics. Is interest rates politics or religion? Most of you would say it's politics or banking law. But actually for the vast majority of the Islamic tradition, the Jewish tradition, and historically the Christian tradition, how much one charges interest is an issue of religious concern. Moreover, while many of us tend to think about religion being involved in the public as always a problematic thing, in this last May's Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh by Geoffrey Stout of Princeton University, himself an atheist, but an engaged political philosopher, he argued over 6 lectures that I got to hear, they'll be out in a year or two, that this story of religion disappearing from politics in the West is, one, not honest, and two, it fails to address the fact that religion has and continues to be a primary actor in Western Europe and North America, not simply in fundamentalist movements, people know this, but in movements of abolition, of civil rights, of feminism, and the right for women to vote, and that actually to tell the story without attending to these more progressive movements of equality and dignity, and to narrate religion out of them is not honest. So in just simply saying we need to separate religion and politics, we lose something of the prophetic possibility of religion. We fail to recognize the diversity within our own traditions, and that they're always contested. And we also fail to grasp the variety and diversity of Islam, and we tend to allow certain interpretations of political Islam to become the essential Muslim. Does that make sense? Some people are looking at me like I have no idea what you're talking about. So with those sort of caveats in mind, I want to talk about something else that all of these stories indicate. And that's the impact that global dynamics, that Christian-Muslim relations have on our local communities, our local politics, and our local abilities to be neighbors. Events that may have once seemed far off. An attack on Christians on Palm Sunday in Alexandria. A stabbing in Hamburg. The bombing or destruction of a mosque in Iraq. A bus trip in Somalia and Kenya. Right? These events that once were far away, actually through globalization, I usually hate that word, migration, Twitter, digital media, now become nearby. Not only do they become nearby, they become existentially near. The breaking down of borders, of national borders that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, of economic borders, of informational borders, ironically has also led to the hardening of borders. We see this in the UK's vote to leave the EU. I live in Scotland, so I don't know anyone who voted to leave the EU. I'm also an academic in a city, so I have a little cluster of people. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to stay. But part of that is to take back control, to be British again. I won't comment on the US election, but one can see similar dynamics in this. Similar dynamics in places like Indonesia, that there's this nostalgic desire to return to what was the pure version of Indonesian identity. One sees it in India, in the increasing rise of right-wing nationalist Hinduism. Right? That in the face of these increasing fractures in borders, you see a stronger clinging to borders, ironically. But what you also see is the way that these global dynamics, nothing more so than the refugee and migration crisis, comes to affect local politics in the West. The refugee crisis did not start in the summer of 2015. It had started for Sudanese and Somalis 20 or 30 years ago. It had started for Syrians in 2011. It was a crisis in Lebanon by the winter of 2011 and 12. It had been one and continues to be one in Jordan and in Turkey and Iraq since 2003. It only became a refugee crisis for many of us when it happened that these human beings, who were the first and foremost ones facing a crisis, began to come onto our news screens and to our images. And of course, then various attacks heightened this. US and UK politics were marked throughout, in both the UK, in both the Brexit election and the Trump-Clinton election, by debates about this. A Syrian refugee that we had never met, a refugee resettlement process that we knew nothing about, was existentially near to us. It was indicative, the Hamburg attack or the Paris attack, of all Muslims everywhere, of every refugee everywhere. In a recent NPR podcast, someone else had listened to this. You're like, why is there a thing on Homer, Alaska? You're wondering what happened to images of... Don't worry, there's going to be a kilt in a second. A recent NPR podcast from This American Life, the most recent one, I listened to on the plane over here. It talks about this small town of Homer, Alaska, which is in, as it said, the last stop on the road. The last U.S. highway after Anchorage that ends in a bay somewhere up there. Had a city referendum, an ordinance that had no legal power. It had no legal power whatsoever. It was just a statement that the city of Homer was committed to being a city of welcome for refugees and for Muslims. There is not a single illegal immigrant in all of Homer, Alaska. The NPR story starts. Do you know a single migrant? No. Do you know a single illegal immigrant in this country, in the city? No. Have you ever met a single illegal immigrant in the city of Homer? No. Well, one time there was this guy that passed through for 2 days, and I don't know here where he was from. There is one Muslim in the entire city of Homer who was born and raised there. And yet, for a month, the entire city was torn apart about this ordinance. The city council and the city meeting was flooded. It made Alaska news, and now it's made NPR's podcast, which those of us that like that sort of thing find out about, where this issue that seemingly was so far off completely divided the local community. Neighbors were yelling at each other of whether or not they were naive or they were unjust, of whether they were realistic, of whether they were real Americans or not. Both sides said the other wasn't, right? Here is the power of what is distant being made near. I think all of us could probably tell some stories in our own lives and our own neighborhoods about the ways in which global political events have come to shape our local realities, where one is forced to speak, maybe, for all Muslims everywhere when an attack happens 7,000 miles away, or one looks away and ignores other events. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say? So what do we do in light of the fact that Christian-Muslim relations inherently exists in this odd space between theology and politics, the very things that we're taught to never talk about at good, proper, cocktail parties and airplane rides? Trust me, don't ever tell anyone you do this if you have a transatlantic flight. And when these pressures for identity seem to want to have us cling stronger to them, when the world does seem fractured and honestly not often safe. I wasn't going to tell a story, but I'm going to. Some of this for me was always distant. That it always seemed like, oh yeah, there's stuff in Paris, there's stuff in Hamburg. Yeah, maybe it could happen, or in London, or in Edinburgh, but I never felt existentially unsafe. Partly because I had lived in the Middle East, I have a number of my closest friends who are Muslims. I knew much better than that this was somehow indicative of Muslims everywhere or refugees. In the month of April, I was in Egypt for the month. And I have never in my life been afraid to go to church. I never thought about it. I was never worried about it. I maybe worried about convincing my daughters to get up out of, leave their TV shows, or convincing myself, right? But I never thought about my safety going to church. But on Easter Sunday, I was not scared, but anxious. I had to cross through 3 metal detectors with my children and my Egyptian friend to go into church. Why? The previous Sunday, as you may have known, there was an attack in Tanta and then in Alexandria. There were many other stories that you could tell about Muslims protecting those churches that Sunday, of donating blood. Those are all true stories. But every single Egyptian Christian that I talked to, who had much more reason to be afraid than I did, I was going to a church with an English-speaking pastor, so they were, of course, going to protect that one, wondered, should I take my family to church on Easter Sunday? Is it worth it? Right? That's just to say that while what I'm going to say is going to try to make arguments for welcome, but I don't want to deny some of those real existential fears and realities. Some of our fears are completely misplaced, are marked through and through by misunderstanding, long-standing Islamophobia, and often racism. Some of them are. But for some people, they're real and they're legitimate. And one of the difficulty things, and this is one thing I really appreciate about being in the UK more than the US, is that there's a need to hold these things in tension and in balance. And in a news cycle, I'm going to talk about this in a second, in news cycles and Twitter and American public media that wants to immediately have black and white, yes or no, 30-second sound bites, that's a hard thing to do. So I want to think with you really briefly, since I always do this, I was going to talk for 45 minutes, about some of the ways we might think of how we might engage with one another across difference, whether that's Christian-Muslim difference or whether that's broader difference. The first one is something that I've harped on before. You may have heard about it. One of the things that was fascinating about the run-up to the US election was this notion that you either were a globalist or you were a real American. That one either had to choose caring and being engaged in the diversity of the world or being rooted in your particularity. I think that false choice often also presents people of religious faith or people of no faith. That one either has to be rooted and grounded in one's own particularity and one's own identity, or one can be open and engaged in interreligious conversation and give up on it because your particularity is going to cause disagreement. I think what we need now is both more awareness of our particularity, more honesty about the rootedness and particularities of our traditions, where they emerge from, how diverse they are, how those come to shape who we are and how we enact in the world. But a particularity that is porous or humble, a particularity that's open to the others. And in the process of being open to the others, one's particularity themselves is changed. The choice isn't between being a Muslim who's then self-enclosed, or a Christian who's then self-enclosed, or an American who's then self-enclosed, or this generic religious spiritual person, or this globalist. Right? It's to say, how can our particularity open up outwards into engagement with the particularity and distinctions and uniqueness of others? I think if there's anything that our current culture needs is a way of being both grounded and open. What Serene Jones, a president at Union Seminary, talks about as a bounded openness. What I like to talk about is a humble particularity. The picture on the left you see is in Egypt, a friend of mine took in Tahrir Square. I mean, they're noticeably, oh, this one on the right, sorry, not the kilt. They're noticeably both Christian and Muslim. Right? And yet they're brought together in their particularity in this struggle against sectarianism and violence. Does anyone know what the other picture is? I had to throw in some Scottish pictures. Can anyone guess what that is? What's that? It's a clan, but none of those people look Scottish. These are all second or third or fourth generation Scots of Pakistani or Indian origin. And about a year ago, they asked if they could get their own tartan. And so here you have this, and Scottish Muslims are quite proud of being both Scottish and Muslim in a way that's quite distinct from English Muslims. There's a lot more tension between the English and Muslims than there is in Scotland. There's a whole host of reasons for this. We can talk about it if you want. But what you see is that they're not losing the particularity of being Pakistani, of being Muslim, right? They still remain proud of those identities, but they're also finding themselves grafted into a new culture, right? That is both a blending of two things, but something new. The color schemes are because of traditional Scottish blue and the traditional green of the Islamic tradition. So one thing I think is, how can we as individuals, as community leaders, as imams, or as doctors, or as teachers, or as parents, nurture a model of particularity that is porous and open? Part of doing this, I think, is refusing neat borders. In other words, defending the notion of gray zones. or refusing the clash of Christendom versus the Dar al-Islam, or Muslims versus Christians, or the Arab versus the West. These kind of binaries that we tend to traffic in when we talk about Christian-Muslim relations. There's a whole host of reasons for this. One is it's not historically accurate. One can tell stories of Baghdad, of Sierra Leone, of southern Spain that trouble these neat stories of Bosnia. These are two books that I would recommend. One is brand new, The Idea of the Muslim World, by a historian, a Turkish historian now at UNC Chapel Hill, where he talks about how this idea of the Muslim world came into being. And he actually argues that it doesn't come into being until the late 19th century. And in the first two chapters, he shows example after example in the 18th and early 19th century in which Christians and Muslims were aligned with one another against other Christians or Muslims or other empires. There is a famous pillar in a church in the Netherlands that says, "Better the Turks than the Papists." Still there. Why? Because the Dutch were aligned with the Turks against the Spaniards. There's a story of the Mughal Empire in India asking the Turks to help them out, and they appealed to religion as a model for helping them out against the British, and the Turks said, "We're actually allies with the British, your appeals to religion don't work." So what he does in this argument is actually show that idea that we have, that in politics the Christians and the Muslims are always against each other, or the West and the Muslims are always against each other, is actually a much more recent phenomenon. It becomes crystallized towards the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, and even more so in the rise of certain groups, both European intellectuals like Renan, Muslim intellectuals that respond to him like Al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu, for those that care. It's an interesting book. It just came out. The other book that I would recommend is The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization. You're thinking to yourself, that's a strange title of a book. What he argues in the first chapter is that the term Judeo-Christian civilization is a very recent invention. If you went in a time machine to 1945, plopped yourself down into New York City, London, Rome, Paris, and you said the word Judeo-Christian, no one would know what you're talking about. That the long rivalry between Christianity and Judaism actually meant it was Christian civilization or Western civilization. It wasn't Judeo-Christian. And that it wasn't until after the Shoah that Christians and Western thinkers were able to reincorporate and re-engage with the Jewish legacies of Christianity. And that the term Judeo-Christian doesn't really come into prominence until the 1950s and 1960s. That Jews and Christians were for a long time antagonists and enemies for most of our history, and still often are. If you want to learn about anti-Semitism, come to Europe for a while. I'm serious, still to this day. It's shocking. Right? That this is something new. You have these cousins that departed and now, and what he tries to argue is that the Islamic and Christian civilizations, whatever we mean by those, could tell a similar story of mutual impact over things like algebra and architecture and philosophy and literature and trade and travel journals. But they drift apart and then into rivalry. And without denying the real rivalry, the real difference, the real arguments, we could actually talk about something like the Islamo-Christian civilization. That things like philosophy or arches or algebra or geometry or medicine aren't possible without the contributions of both. It's a fascinating way to rethink these visions. Now, of course, history isn't vital, but it doesn't change necessarily the present day. But it does help us tell that story differently and inhabit the present differently. One of the chief aims, I don't like to talk about ISIS, they get too much noise, but one of the chief aims that ISIS has in attacking Christians in Egypt is to try to drive out Christians from Egypt to further create this divide, the Muslim world, the Western world. That one of the reasons that they talk about this, that the refugees shouldn't have gone on Hijra there, they should have come to, they still had some territory then, they should have come to northern Iraq and to Syria. Right? That this is a problem. And one of the reasons they said is they want to eliminate the gray zones of coexistence. That nurturing the kind of ardent nationalism that we've seen growing all over Europe is part and parcel of what those lone wolf or terror attacks are aimed to do. To refuse this narrative, to nurture and exist in ways of humble particularity in gray zones of coexistence, is one way that we can exist between theology and politics that is just a rivalry. Two final things. One, we need to contextualize the news. I was, sorry, I'm trying to read something. Not an email, something I'm going to read to you. Events, part of the power of these events that we've talked about earlier is that they become beamed into our living room. We're eating dinner, watching a Christmas fair be run over in Berlin. Right? We can imagine ourselves at that Christmas fair in Berlin, or at that cafe in Paris, or in that club in Orlando. So those news stories come nearby. The difficulty is that often we can't, for many of us, locate ourselves at Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. Some of us can, most of us can't. Or in Gaza, or in Baghdad, or in Jakarta. Right? We can't, so we actually don't have sympathy for those victims, so those news stories don't hit. But also what we can't do is see that those news stories are just a small sliver of a much broader reality in places like Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Jordan and Germany and Greece. So you hear, for instance, of stories of Germany being overrun by refugees and migrants. Since I've moved to Edinburgh, I've been to Germany 5 times. It is not overrun. I've interacted with the head of the Reformed Church in Germany who says their churches are actually being revived because finally Germans who thought, what's the point of the church except for to baptize and bury me, is now engaged in work that seems meaningful and beyond esoteric. That people that haven't gone to church for 5 or 10 years now suddenly see that the gospel means something in an embodied way in Germany. Those aren't stories that one hears. You don't hear stories of Lebanese families welcoming Syrians into their home in Beirut. Right? You don't hear about Syrians getting jobs. What you hear about are things like, I had to pick on the Daily Mail, right? The swarm on our streets. To live somewhere, to travel somewhere, to befriend someone helps us contextualize the news. In a novel that Amy Waldman wrote called The Submission, she has this lovely line that stayed with me. I quote it all the time. She's talking about a Bangladeshi illegal immigrant in New York whose husband had died in the World Trade Center bombing, who's trying to eke her way into an existence in the Bangladeshi community of New York. She writes this: amazing how chaotic and impossible things could seem when they were concentrated into a few pages of black and white print, instead of diluted into the long days of red chilies drying in the sun, light dancing on the water, tales of marriages arranged and awry, the tunes of Runa Layla, her niece's sweet laugh, her mother's spicy fish, her father's comic stories of waking the sleeping guards at his rice mill, the swaddled peace of daydreams. The worst things then had their balance, could be put in their place. That lived life, relationships, marriages, food, dreams, laughter, existed between the print about what had happened in Bangladesh, of floods, chaos. This is true of all the news stories you read. There's been no greater gift, I think, for many of us that have traveled or lived abroad, to actually see the normalcy of other places. The life, the joy, the suffering, the hope. And yet we're increasingly asked by the news to make one single event, one single person, one single community indicative of a whole region, a whole country, a whole religion. All the while, when someone that's like us does something, they're always the exception. I feel no need to speak for Dylan Roof. I feel no need to speak for Andreas Breivik, Norway attacker. I feel no need to speak for any of them. And yet I continually, or my news media is continually asking my friends to speak from someone from Pakistan, but they were born and raised as Bosnians in Glasgow. So both contextualizing the news in terms of seeing the broader picture, but also not asking news stories to become icons for the whole world. At the same time, we don't deny the real realities and real pain that those news stories entail. Right? It's not to say that ISIS doesn't exist, or that terror doesn't exist, or that racism doesn't exist, or that police brutality doesn't exist, or that whatever doesn't exist, right? But to locate it in a broader story and not allow our own relationships to become more shaped by these distant news than anything else. I'll close with this story. Embodied solidarity is a term that Larisha Hawkins, former professor at Wheaton College and now visiting at UVA, spoke about when she decided to wear the hijab as a Christian during Advent. That it wasn't enough simply to speak theologically about Muslims, but that one wanted to embody, after talking to other Muslim leaders, something of a presence alongside. Not a blurring of the line, she didn't become a Muslim, but an embodied solidarity that moved beyond simple discourse or debate. That the invitation of humble particularity, of breaking down gray zones of coexistence, of engaging and contextualizing the news only matters if there's actually acts of embodied solidarity and engagement. This picture is the most memorable meal of my life. It's at a church hall, I don't know where, somewhere in the northern part of Greece. It was cooked by Iraqi and Syrian women. Layla, Fatima, Aisha. They had worked all day, all night to cook their favorite Syrian and Iraqi food for a group of German, Italian, Greek, Spanish, American Christians. They had given it as a gift of joy, a gift that said, we still have life. We still have beauty and taste to offer. It was an image of that promised meal. The church that I had this meal at is a small village A small church, a small Protestant church. There's not many Protestants in Greece. In the northern part of Greece, a city called Katerini. You'll never go there. It's not on the tourist map. I went there as part of an act of solidarity in this task force to be alongside the Greek church as they responded to the migration crisis months after the TV news cameras had moved on to Brexit and to Trump and to Macron. In this small village, this small church, still under an economic crisis, had suddenly found themselves with nearly 100,000 refugees, Yazidis, Christians, Muslims, Iraqis, Afghans, Syrians, at their borders, and winter was approaching. This church that was so small that had no abilities to do this, no training to be engaged. They didn't speak Arabic. Only half of them could speak even a little bit of English. They didn't have any money. But they began to go into these makeshift camps on the border of Macedonia to offer medical care, to connect refugees to lawyers so that they could be put on the list of asylum seekers to be resettled across Europe. They realized that some of them had empty spare rooms, and people moved into them. They figured out that the food bank that they were using to serve their fellow Greek citizens who were still themselves under economic crisis, could be expanded to include refugees. People started to come into their church, and so they turned the basement into a class for both English and Greek, in case people were to stay. It was nothing miraculous. It didn't get people across the border, except for maybe 2 or 3. It didn't solve the refugee crisis, but it was an act of consistent, constant, beautiful care once the news media had left. On the last night, we had a formal dinner with the elders of this Presbyterian church, with the pastor. We asked about why this church had engaged so much, and they said, well, we were at first afraid. We had seen the same news as everyone else. We were worried that these young men were going to be really terrorists. We knew about it. But then she started to go into the village, and they came down, and we realized they had kids, and their kids needed school. And slowly we began to build the relationships. And once you start building relationships and you start loving someone, it turns out that love casts out fear. I don't know where I heard that. They said there's another thing. We don't tell many people this. This church wasn't here 100 years ago, or even 90. None of us are actually from Greece. Our grandparents and our great-grandparents are from Pontus, a city on the Black Sea, which is today Turkey. During the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, the creation of the nation-state of Greece and of Turkey, not only were Armenians expelled, but Turks that lived in Greece were expelled into Turkey, and Greeks that lived in Turkey were expelled into Greece. And this community in the 1920s were forced to leave the northern part of what is now Turkey and to wander. They ended up for 18 months on the outskirts of a city called Aleppo, until 18 months later, they left Syria to go to Greece. The elder said, we are simply repaying to the grandkids and the great-grandkids the very gift of hospitality that was given to us. Remember, care for the refugee, for the migrant, for you too were a refugee. Thank you. I mean, I'll keep talking, but want to hear stories about Sicily?
I just wondered, what's the best thing we can do here, to help the global situation?
Well, I don't live in Richmond anymore, but one of the things that was in most cities in the world, not all, but most, the globe is actually in your backyard. If you were to travel around Richmond, if you were to take an inventory just of your regular life, even if you weren't trying, you would figure out that you encounter a lot more religious, ethnic, and national diversity than you ever realized, if you attend to it. Maybe your doctor, maybe your pharmacist, maybe the person who cooks your meal, grocery shop attendant. So one thing is actually to attend to what's already present, and to attend into a way that begins to nurture relationships. As we know, the United States and many cities are broken down by lots of boundaries and borders. Here in Richmond, you've got the river, you've got the east side and the west side, you've got historically white and black. And now into these historic differences and disagreements, we're seeing lots of things. Increasing number of Latino and Latina communities, Chinese communities, South Asian communities, many of which have been here very long as well. So one thing in terms of locally is to say, how do we actually attend to the diversity that's already here? How do we begin to build honest relationships, not generic ones? One of the things that I think one can do, one of the reasons I'm here back in Richmond, is to begin to think a little more honestly and a little more in depth about what it is that we're talking. I'm here to talk about Islam and Christianity, so I'm just going to focus on Muslims, although we could extend some of this out to a lot of other traditions. Most of the people in our communities that aren't Muslims know very, very little about Islam and very, very little about Muslims and their lives, their passions, their hopes, their dreams, their traditions. What they do know primarily comes through things like this, or by fairly banal, well-meaning, liberal mumbo-jumbo. That's a technical academic term. Right? Let's all get along. So one of the things we need to nurture is the way of actually, one, learning about other traditions and some of their diversity and challenging these simplistic accounts. I know Ahmad, I'm picking on you, spoke to the class that I'm teaching last night and talked about the desire for him and for many other Muslims to be allowed for the Muslim story to be as complicated and rich, good, bad, and everyone in between as we allow the Christian story or the American story. Allow our theology, our narratives, our history to be as messy as yours, which I think is actually a good place to start. Is that a fair quote? Shwaya. So I think that's one thing. But it's not, there's also the risk of actual engagement. The risk of actual engagement, and engagement not on your terms, but in an honest exchange. I think many of us that are in places of power or privilege are willing to have exchange on our terms, but to allow for the kind of discomfort that actual real difference engages. So that's some things. I'll give you another. Look, put your vote and your body on the line, and your money. So get a little preachy. But it's very important for me yes, have there been attacks against civilians that are deadly and death-dealing in Europe in the last 2 years? Yes. Do we need to be serious about that? Yes. Do there need to be legal mechanisms in regards of who are migrants or not? Yes. I will say all of those things is true. The second thing I want to say is those things pale in comparison to the kind of death, violence, destruction, and despair that have been wrought on the people of Syria. And that we seem to be completely willing to say that that doesn't matter as much. So how is one going to actually here's another thing. Sorry, preacher mode. My wife works in international development. She works for CARE International, which is one of the larger U.S. NGOs. They run the refugee camps in Jordan. It was a refugee crisis for them in 2012. Do you know why there was an increasing number of refugees that suddenly started to cross into Europe in the summer of 2015? Was it because this was just suddenly the war just started? No, they had been in camps for 2 or 3 or 4 years. There's a few reasons. One is that there was again and again no real political will to engage with the Syrian issue, that people lost hope that it was ever going to be resolved, that the world had moved to other things, that it had become the ground between Saudis and Iranians and Russians and Americans and Iraqi, everybody. That's one reason. The second reason is none of us actually followed through on what we promised refugee camps. Refugee camps were running out of money. That Europe, the United States, and other places had promised organizations like CARE, like the UN, like Oxfam, that had funded and run these refugee camps in Turkey, in Jordan, and in Lebanon. And they were already on a shoestring budget, and less than 50% of their funding had come. Those two things happened. We don't talk about those two things. Right? So that's just to say, I think actually we could also financially engage. And I mean, I don't know about the Richmond community, but in Edinburgh, for instance, Scotland has received more refugees. Well, 40% of the refugees that have been resettled into the UK have been resettled into Scotland. There's reasons for that. Partly Scotland is more open to refugees than England and Wales. Partly we have a emigration problem. There's not enough people living there. More people are leaving. If you've been in the north and tried to find a job, you'd understand. Everybody lives in Glasgow or Edinburgh or this belt. So that's one of the reasons. So I mean, it's not just genuine Scottish. They like to talk about how great they are, but there's an economic reason too. Many of the refugees, I don't know if anyone saw this article recently, if you follow me on Facebook, you did, about a Syrian in Newfoundland, who for 1.5 years hasn't met a single Canadian of any significance. I speak some Arabic. I was on a bus. I overheard someone speaking Arabic in Edinburgh. It was an accent that I could recognize as Syrian. I simply said, hello, how are you doing? Next thing I know, he's talking my ear off faster than I can understand and process the Arabic. This is his wife. This is a child. They've been here for 1 year. No one he knew spoke Arabic. He was sure I didn't speak Arabic. Was I Palestinian? No, I didn't. He didn't quite understand my relationship to Palestine. Could I come to your house for a meal? Right? Let's not underestimate. I mean, this is partly what I was pointing to here. I mean, but the difficulty is to see in this church, it wasn't for a one-off event to make themselves feel good that they did the one thing. Many of us, I'm talking especially of white, wealthy, well-meaning liberal Protestants, we love to do it for the photos, for the sermon analogies. But the actual sustained hard work, when things start breaking down, when it troubles your congregation, I quit. Anyway, that's a long answer to your short question. It was literally a 7-minute answer. I'll do better, or you can leave. Yeah. I think, I've talked a few times about the issue of not wanting to essentialize. This is how this is how Muslims are writ large. This is how, although I've just essentialized white liberal Protestants, but I am one of those, so I can essentialize myself. This is how Southerners are. This is how Californians are. I'm one of those too. Right? This is how Christians are. Okay, so that's what I want to avoid. What I'm talking about with particularity is, I think I have as a theologian, I have some deep theological ideas way behind here. And this is actually a very Christian idea, and many Muslims, and we've talked about this, will bristle at this. But in the Christian tradition, the general truth about God gets revealed in this strange particularity of one human life. Now, it's much broader than that. It's a story of creation, and of prophets, and of law, and of speech. But somehow, it moves from the particular out to the world. What Luther calls the scandal of particularity. That actually, in attending more closely to the particularity and difference of people, one actually can open oneself out to commonalities. If one actually, think about it this way. The best novel, the best serial TV show, since those are even more popular than movies now, the best film, it tells the story about a general reality, not by talking generically, but by telling a rich and textured story of a particular life, or a particular town, or a particular day, or a particular story. And from that, people can note themselves in the story, but also the difference with themselves, right? So I think some of it's what I'm trying to get at, that actually going deeper into particularity can actually open us up. And if actually one begins to, we've talked about this in the class that I've been teaching, if one begins to engage more deeply in the particularity of how, for instance, Muslims think about the Quran as God's speech. And to think about this, the class noted a lot of weird similarities. Well, is the recitation of the Quran kind of like preaching? Is the recitation of the Quran kind of like the way Lutherans think about sacraments? Is the recitation of the Quran and their views about the Quran as the eternal Word of God kind of like how we think about Jesus? It wasn't just these generic things, it was that we actually started reading and thinking and engaging with a particular of the text that you then draw these analogies. So that is more theological, but what I'm trying to say is that there is a tendency right now in our culture to think that particularity, whether that's the particular of a nation, of a race, of a religion, needs to sort of close in on itself and tell a pure story. One, the pure story is not true, right? It's always mixed and muddled. The other is that one can actually be deeply grounded in a particular, but also open to engagement for the world. In fact, let me say it this way. My own deep particularity as someone who foolishly spent a lifetime, well, not a lifetime, but over a decade, studying Christian theology in its very particular instantiation, has helped me tremendously, as I became a scholar of Islam as well, read Islamic texts. Not because I say, oh, those are exactly the same, but you learn certain habits of ways of noticing difference, of uniqueness, of particularity, right? If anyone's I'll give you another example, personally. When I moved to I lived in Egypt before and I lived in Palestine before. When I moved there, I knew I was moving somewhere different. I knew that the language was different. I knew that the religion was different. I knew that the weather was different. I knew the food was different. I girded my loins for being an expat. That's just a privileged way of saying migrant. And actually, it turned out it was different, but it wasn't as different as I thought. People still loved and lost and fought. Things got boring. Things that I would have thought would be the most magical thing to see, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the Dome of the Rock, or the pyramids, or things that, yeah, every once in a while you'd be like, oh, wow, that's incredible, I can't believe I live here. But at other times you're just like, oh, there's that again. When I moved to the UK, I didn't gird my loins for living in a cross-cultural situation. I spoke English, I watched British TV, their food's, I was ready for the bad coffee. But other than that, it turns out the coffees are actually quite good now. What I actually found out is that it's really different. It's as much, if not more, of a cross-cultural experience than it was living in Palestine or in Egypt. That's an exaggeration, but, right? That actually the particularity of this particular place, even what appears to be normal. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, can we nurture that kind of particularity that celebrates it without essentializing it? But this is also why I use this image. Identities aren't fixed. What you here may think of as the normal Christian way of life, or the northern southern way of life, or the normal Richmond way of life, or the normal way that one goes to church or goes to mosque or doesn't go to church or doesn't go to mosque, if you went 50 years ago in this very city, it would seem abnormal. This room would seem abnormal. Me talking about this would seem abnormal. The complexity and makeup of this room would be different. Now, let's times that by the history of just, let's say, the United States, or the Christian tradition, or the Islamic tradition, right? So, and I guess this image I like because they're remaining distinctly Muslim and distinctly Pakistani, but they're also taking on Scottishness, and Scottish identity is changing in light of this. Catherine Tanner, in her book Theories of Culture, talks a lot about this sort of dynamic interplay, that culture isn't a fixed thing, it's a constantly dynamic and changing thing. The older I get, the less and I realize that my undergraduate students next year will have been born when I graduated from university. Like, you start realizing that culture changes. So I guess that's what I'm saying with particularity, not that it's just this thing. Does that help? Thanks. Again, that was a 6-minute answer.
I just wanted to say thank you for remembering Indonesia, because I was born in a Baptist missionary hospital in Indonesia, as a fancy way of saying expat. And my best friend growing up was Muslim. So I was not in a predominantly Christian culture until I was much older. And I had a totally different worldview that was rocked when I came home and discovered that Christians were in the minority, and that nobody else understood the kind of culture that I had as a child growing up. One of the difficulties I have when I teach young children is discussing this kind of thing for kids who have never had any international experiences the way that I had,
Yeah.
and that the news isn't just inundating to adults, it's very, very inundating to children.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, you mentioned that you had children when you moved.
They're still there.
What your approach is to educating multiculturalism and multiple religious views for people who are young?
Yeah, that's really helpful. A couple things. One, I forgot my favorite line of the talk, which is, when I landed in Jakarta, I saw and experienced what I kind of knew, which is two things. The world is not white. It's primarily brown. Sit in the Jakarta airport or the Dubai airport and you realize people like me with my skin hue are not the main part of the story. One. Two, Christianity is not Western and Islam is not Arab. Now, of course, Christianity has been fundamentally shaped by the Western tradition. The Western tradition has shaped Christianity. Of course, Islam has been shaped fundamentally by Arab and Arab culture. But they're not just those things. And that was viscerally true and present. And I think with Indonesia, to tell the story as if it's much more in the center than on the periphery is one important way to think about this. In terms of children, my daughters have had both the privilege and they're going to have the challenge of living as something like third culture kids. My older daughter, Adele, lived with us in Egypt and in Palestine. She then lived in Richmond. Now she lives in Edinburgh. And we just moved. We got evicted and we had to move house. I sound like a Brit. And she sobbed uncontrollably because she thought we were moving and having to start a new school when we were literally moving like a mile away, right? So there's those challenges. But at the same time, it's been an incredible gift for her to identify and engage with and have friends with people from all over the world. So I can't speak to how you do that more broadly, right? Because I actually live in a place that is quite internationally diverse, right? My daughter's teachers are Spanish and Greek and Turkish and one Scot. But I do think finding ways to begin to, like you said, children are way more perceptive than we realize. Children pick up on news, on public discourse in ways that are much more profound than you realize. And I think finding ways to encourage and encounter real, genuine you got it. I mean, how do you balance giving them a safe home and showing that their home's in the world? And that's a hard thing to do. It's happened to us kind of by accident because of both of our work. I mean, we spent a month in Egypt because of my wife's work. But it's also important for us to continue to nurture those things. And what we found out is that my daughter, having lived in an Arab-speaking world, we continually to try to have her have an Arabic tutor, has opened up her heart to what's happening in the world in a way that is not true of other things that happen. We never talked about it. I mean, she knows that there's something in Syria. You could not see the refugee crisis. You're in, right? But there was a way in which that connected to her in a way, because in a much deeper way than other things. In the same way that probably Indonesia would for you. The most challenging theological questions that I've had in my life have now come from her. If God could send a whale to save Jonah in that same sea, why can't God send a whale to save all of the refugees drowning? Why do we pray every night for the end of the war in Syria, and yet it seems to keep happening over and over? Now, my younger daughter is not as theologically inclined. Maybe that's because, well, no, that's just her own personality. But to say, I think part of why Adele connects so deeply to those stories is that those are human beings that are like her friends, that are her teachers. And I think, the issue is, and this goes back to your question, we don't want to instrumentalize other people. The last thing I want you to do is say, for those of us in the room who are not Muslims, hey, let's go find a Muslim buddy that we can instrumentalize. Right? Our black friend. Right? Like, that is the worst possible way to approach a relationship. So how do you nurture a genuine awareness of the world, but not be artificial? If you live in Richmond, or Charlottesville, or Virginia Beach, those are the places I've heard people say, or Peoria, Illinois, your city's already that way. I'm guessing that your school, even in the richest part of town, your kid's school is increasingly going that way. That the kids your kids start noticing very early is that while they may have friends at school, who is it that your parents are hanging out with? Like, my kids pick up on this. My daughter, she has picked up that Edinburgh, this is what 7-year-old said. She's so excited to be back in Richmond because she'll finally see people with black skin like her best friend Meseret. Because Edinburgh is it's a white and Pakistani town. Right? Kids, pick up on these sorts of things. So I guess, how do you nurture this in a way that's not instrumentalized? Oh, Karen Marie already left. If there's any Christian educators, I think that's one of the challenges. But there are increasingly really good books and kids' books that can help us do that. I think there's a way of engaging in churches. I don't know if you're involved in a church or not, in ways that cut across these lines. I'm not a fan of one-off mission trips, although there's reason for that. So I guess that's a long way of saying I don't know. Anyway, I'm aware we're past our time.
Just on the maybe advertisement or suggestions, part of this has had to be, I fully agree with the theme that relationships make all the difference, and being intentional about being in a relationship makes all the difference. So for those that aren't aware, we've got a wonderful asset here with VCU, because we have a sizable student body that is in our backyard from many different nationalities, and VCU is hungry for local educators to put them in connection with, to form relationship, not token, but through the course of the year. So anybody that has interest, there's an easy way to form relationships multi-generational for us to start to, if it's not in your own backyard, it is in your own backyard.
Yeah, thank you. I think once one makes a relationship that's really a sustained one across whatever difference, whether it's linguistic, ethnic, racial, regional, it actually becomes, it's like learning a language. The more you do it, the more natural it becomes. Like at one point I was thinking none of my, I had to stop and take an inventory of who my friends are in Edinburgh because we don't have the same intentional faith form that happened in Richmond. So it's not this moment where the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews get together, and so you can all physically see it. But what you realize is if actually you start nurturing and practicing and actually enjoying and loving and sharing in meals and in food and in sport or in music, whatever it is, you end up running into these other people, right? And so I think the VCU example is a great one. I don't know, in Atlanta where I used to live, there was a huge and recurring and continuing need for recently resettled refugees. I know that there's not that many at the moment because of political things here, for people who are willing to help with language skills, to help with driving people around. That can be a real gift to someone, and sometimes that turns into a lifelong friendship. Sometimes it's just a gift that you give over a month or two. And so the VCU is a great example.